Well, hey, everybody, this episode is brought to you by my own company, ISOAMP. So we have like a 1-week hiatus where we have a new sponsor starting on July 1st. And so I wanted to talk about ISOAMP a little bit on this episode. But we're going to talk today to Josh from Helios Payments about high risk. I don't know about you, Patti, but I definitely learned a few things and had a great conversation.
I really did too. And it was much more, it seemed to me that it's much more approachable than I thought it was before we spoke to Josh.
Yeah, I agree. He did a good job breaking it down. And so the topic is how to build a profitable portfolio with high risk. I think everybody would be pleasantly surprised at some of the progress that he's been making with being able to place CBD, cannabis, things like that. So very interesting conversation. Then questions from the field. I talk about how to sell dual pricing, share some of my experiences from the field, the phone, Zoom, different ways I've been selling dual pricing myself personally, and some of that. And then Patti, tell us about the insiders.
We have an update on crypto. If anybody's been paying attention, crypto's been crashing a lot lately in value, but there's some other interesting news. Stick around to the end and listen.
Awesome.
So are you ready to get going?
Let's do it.
Welcome to the Merchant Sales Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Patti and I are here today with Josh Ewin, who is the COO at Helios Payments. How are you doing today, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you.
So Josh is really an expert on high risk merchant accounts. And this is such an interesting topic. We're going to really dive in today to get practical and kind of talk about how to build a profitable portfolio out of high risk. It's an area that I think a lot of agents that would listen to our podcast just don't have a lot of understanding, or there's a lot of confusion around that. But before we dive into that topic, Josh, give us your background a little bit. You haven't been on for a little while. Give our audience kind of a flavor of like, how did you get into this crazy industry? And then how did you end up, going after these high risk accounts?
Yeah, sure. So my background for a long time has been marketing. About 12 years ago, our CEO and I formed a company called Athena Beauty Labs. And we were high risk merchants. We sold skincare products on trial in the US and the UK for about 7 or 8 years. The hardest part of that business for us was the merchant processing, right? Mm-hmm. So chargebacks, complaints, terminations, all that stuff we had to deal with. And we got really an intimate knowledge of what that looks like from the merchant side firsthand. So fortunately, our CEO used to be in ISO, sold his book of business years ago, but after a few years, we built up, a processing department. We had a lot of connections with the banks. So about 7 years ago, we launched out Helios Payments. And our focus for Helios is purely high-risk e-com.
So born of necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But, I think that experience gives us perspective and gives us a unique way to communicate with our merchants and also to educate our agents about the space.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I love it. So let's do this, Josh. Kind of as we get practical here and dive into the details, let's start with business types, because I think the word, the term high risk merchant account means a lot of different things to different people. And I think it changes over time too, as different regulations come out and different things. So talk to us about what business types are you seeing success with? What are some trends that you're seeing, maybe types that seem more high risk now than they did, or ones that are becoming low risk? So give us a little bit of insight there.
Yeah, sure. So I think first we need to define more clearly what high risk is, because there are different views of high risk depending on which risk department, which underwriting department you go to, right? So you go to PPS with, let's say, a Kratom deal, right? They're going to turn you away. If you go to an underwriting team that handles and underwrites Kratom, then that's not necessarily high risk, and it's not even Kratom CBD in the usual suspects. It can be even just large ticket types, travel, credit repair. There are a lot of different things that fall under high risk, but at its core, high risk is high risk for the bank. It's a higher risk of chargebacks, higher reputational risk, and so on. So it's definitely a different animal. In terms of the verticals that we're seeing recently, for years and years, the sort of soup and nuts for high risk was nutraceuticals. So you've seen skincare offers, diet offers, all that stuff online. That was kind of the bread and butter, along with trial billing, because that had been just rampant for years and years. That's changing. We're seeing in the past year a broader variety of kinds of merchants. So there's still some Nutra in there, Still CBD distillates like Delta 8, Delta O, Delta 10, but also stuff like lending and payday loans, gadgets. We've got even education in our portfolio. So it is changing, and I'll tell you, CBD is one of those categories that's constantly changing, and it has always constantly changed. I think that's just indication of how new it is in terms of regulation. But we try and keep our finger on the pulse of kind of what's changing, what's working, who's approving what, and so on.
Yeah, well,
CBD is almost. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that a lot of times the verticals that change the most are the ones that are more the reputational risk, it seems like, where it's kind of like, the banks are like, do we want to be associated with this or not? And then over time, I'll see it shift one way, then it'll go back the other way. And it's kind of just depends on a lot of variables versus like the financial risk seems to be a little more kind of obvious. It's like, look, if you're getting a lot of chargebacks, you're a financial risk. And so it's kind of more quantifiable, it would seem.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Josh, I'd like to talk about prospecting. How and where do you identify these high risk accounts? I mean, it seems to me, like you said, things like what are they? Nutraceuticals.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a word. Yeah. That and CBD. I mean, those are the ones that jump up, and I see lots of those around. But obviously this is a much bigger market, and I'm just wondering, as an agent out there thinking about going into high risk, how do they identify some of these prospective accounts?
So some of it, is pretty easy. If you have an agent that is used to doing, door-to-door sales and hitting restaurants and bodegas and whatnot, they're going to see CBD shops. They're going to see dispensaries. That kind of stuff kind of sticks out. I think the real money and the real volume in terms of leads, agents really need to stop thinking locally in terms of prospecting and marketing, and start thinking more globally. So LinkedIn is a great source. Trade shows, absolutely a great source, right? Because you can find trade shows that are very niche specific. One that is great is Affiliate Summit. It's been around for years. They do an East Coast and a West Coast. They also do Berlin and I think Southeast Asia or something. So shows like that can really be a great source for leads. For us, for a long time, we've done trade shows and also networking. So networking with other vendors in the merchant's ecosystem. So customer support teams, fulfillment teams, formulators, they all have a high touch relationship with the merchant. And they're hearing on a weekly basis, what's working, what's not. Hey, oh my God, I just lost a ton of mids. I'm going to have to, slow down our orders this week. They hear that stuff. So if an agent can form a relationship with, those types of vendors, that could be a great consistent source of leads. And just kind of adding to that, we found that those kind of relationships really only work if it's reciprocal. Right.
Of course.
So what we've done is, for that networking piece, we typically have one vendor per, kind of service type that we're partnered with. So that way, we're giving them as much love as we can, and we get, leads in return. Content marketing is another great strategy. Obviously, it's a bit of a longer game. Content marketing, social, that's something we do and we've done for a long time. And there's other benefits besides prospecting and SEO and stuff for doing that. But yeah, again, I think the biggest shift is, looking less, on your block and looking more online to find those leads.
Sure. Okay. So once you get the leads, what do you do in terms of reaching out to contact them, and what does the sales cycle look like? I mean, I would imagine it's a little bit different than, selling to a restaurant or a bodega, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's going to depend on where the leads come from. With that strategy that we were talking about with networking, it's so effective because the leads are warm when they come to you, and they come from a recommendation, right? So by the time you have that conversation, the merchant is already keyed up and interested and needs help. And one big change here that I think, again, is a bit of a shift for low risk agents is that merchants in the high risk space, for the most part, they're not going to fight over 10 basis points, right? They're less worried about price and more worried about things like can you actually support my vertical? Like really support it. Not just say you are, but support it.
And not close the door next week.
Yeah, exactly. Which I mean, we can have a whole
conversation on that. Sure.
About Stripe and Square and how they deal with high risk, but yeah, high risk merchants, they want to know that you can support them, that you can get them as much approved monthly volume as possible. And that is really it. And also that you have the reach to maybe get them into banks that they don't have access to right now. So that's the biggest shift.
Yeah, that's a really good lead in actually for my next question, because I wanted to talk a little bit about, just getting deals approved. So let's say, you reach out, you have a good contact, you talk to them about it. They show interest. The big challenge with high risk, at least for most agents in the industry, is they're like, hey, I've got these deals. I found this CBD shop or whatever it is, but I don't know how to get it approved. So talk a little bit about how Helios Payments approaches that. I'm assuming you have different relationships and things. And so how do you go about actually getting these deals placed and approved without hopefully putting the agent and the merchant through, a lot of different hoops and trial and error,
Yeah, well, I mean, we should definitely talk just a little bit about the underwriting process because it is going to be different for high risk. High risk is definitely more invasive and takes longer than low risk. So agents should be prepared for that. But for Helios Payments, our job is to find the right banks, plural banks, for the merchant. We've got partnerships with 35 different acquirers. So pretty much any vertical that a merchant has, whether it's in the US or the EU, we can support. And our underwriting team is very familiar with the different rules that each bank has. And we're also very familiar with the application process, and it gets kind of detailed. The banks you app to first, how you're apping, how much you're apping for, MCC codes, all that stuff. So our team is really familiar with that. So if you have an agent that maybe has a handful of high risk leads, and they're partnered with, let's say, Bantif or PPS or someone, they need more than just one bank to take those two, right?
Right.
And that's, I think, where we come in with access to all of our banks. When an agent signs up with us, they've got immediate access to every bank in our portfolio.
And I think, Josh, it's interesting here to almost take a little side note because, again, as you're talking, and I'm trying to imagine how our audience is receiving it, and I'm wondering how much they really understand about high risk, and even just processing in general. I think with low risk, it's easy to kind of feel like, well, why does a bank even really need to be involved? And what does a bank do? It's low risk. They approve it. And there's not this understanding of this money flow, but talk a little bit about how does this actually work? I mean, why is this a risk for the bank financially, not reputational, but let's talk about the financial side for a second. Why is it that a bank might not want to take a particular merchant account?
Sure. If we're looking just purely at financials, it is the risk of chargebacks and refunds. Mm-hmm. So imagine, for instance, and just to kind of put things into context, when you get into high risk processing, oftentimes we're not talking about merchants doing $5,000 or $10,000 a month. We're talking about merchants doing 50, 100, 200. I got a merchant doing $500,000 a month. I mean, larger volumes. And that can happen really, really fast, especially if a merchant is using affiliate marketing, which is often the case with high risk processing. So the bank's risk there is the chargebacks that are coming in and the refunds that are coming in, they need to be dealt with, right? If the merchant is still live and has money in the bank account, those chargebacks and refunds come out of there. But if a merchant ramps up their volume and gets $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a month, there's a lag with the chargebacks, right? Mm-hmm. So customer orders today, you may not see that chargeback for 30 days.
Right.
So if the merchant closes their doors, shuts the bank account, someone has to pay for those refunds and chargebacks. And ultimately, it's the sponsor bank.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And I think that's very important for people to understand that, these payment processing accounts are really a form of lending in a way,
right.
In some ways, because there is that lag time. And so they're fronting this money and saying, we are trusting that this transaction is legitimate and that the merchant has the funds to cover the refund of the chargeback in the case that it happens. And so the banks have to evaluate that. And so things like bank balance, that on a low risk merchant account, no one's asking what's the merchant's bank balance. But on a high risk, if somebody's going to do $100,000 a month and their bank balance is usually around $10,000, that may be troublesome. Right, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, you can get approvals, if you have a merchant that has, let's say credit score of 680 and, 5,000 in the bank account, you can get approvals with that, assuming everything else in the package is clean. But yeah, absolutely. That's where the risk comes in. And there's just kind of, adding to that, there is a sort of a teeter-totter effect between rates and a merchant's reserve account, which we'll get into just a second. There are a lot of pieces to this, right?
Yes, yeah.
Right. So high risk merchants, typically a bank will take 10% of every dollar that's processed and put it into a separate non-interest bearing account called a reserve account.
Right.
It's typically held for 6 months on a rolling basis. So the more money that is in that and the higher the fees are, the less perceived risk there is for the bank. So oftentimes we'll have high risk merchants say, hey, can you negotiate a reserve release for me with the bank? And we'll say, yeah, we could do that. But keep in mind that if we reduce your reserve balance and your chargeback spike, that's going to kind of put you on the radar. So yeah, there are a lot of pieces to high risk processing.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and let's unpack just a little bit more, and then we'll get on to the next question here. But again, I think this is so valuable. This is a good part of because to me, I really want people to understand what this is. I think it's so important, right? So the reserve account, let's talk about that for one more second. So again, we have a situation where, let's take a travel merchant, maybe that'd be a good example. So I pay for a trip, I prepay for this cruise I'm going to take in 3 months. Well, 2 months down the road, I decide, you know what? I don't think I really want to do that trip. So I'm going to go ahead and I have a cancellation policy. So I'm going to cancel this. And I spent $5,000 on this trip. So now I go ahead and I cancel this and I say, I want to, get my refund. Well, let's say that the merchant has shut their doors, they've shut their bank account and they no longer exist. Well, now all of a sudden the bank who, I go to my bank and my bank goes to the merchant's bank and says, hey, we got to get this $5,000, right? So talk about within that context, Josh, what is the reserve account and why is that important to the bank?
Yeah. So the reserve account is there in case of things like that, right?
Right.
The reserve account is there if the merchant closes their bank account, then the bank needs someplace to pull those chargebacks or refunds from, and it usually comes from that reserve account.
Yeah, got it. So it's kind of a extra cushion, I guess we would say, right? A risk cushion. And over time, if they're pulling 10% out, it's going to grow and they're going to have more of a cushion there. We're going to get to the fees in a second. So let's move on to the next question here. So, okay, we have a deal approved. We got through all this underwriting and all this stuff. And okay, the deal's good to go, right? Talk about activating the accounts. What is kind of traditional equipment versus virtual terminal software? What's involved usually with getting these accounts activated? And of course, I know it's going to vary by business type, but give us a little flavor of that.
Sure. Well, actually, it's much more simple than it would be for a retail merchant where you have to, order the equipment, get it shipped out. Maybe there's leasing involved. I just wrapped up a lease deal for like 4 or 5 Clover terminals, and it was not fun. It was not fun. There's a whole lot of phone calls to sort out the lease and get the equipment delivered. And with high risk e-com, it's really just deploying the gateway. And typically NMI is the gateway deployed. That's kind of the de facto high risk payment gateway.
Sure.
It's that easy. We get it deployed the same day, send the credentials to the agent or the merchant, and NMI will integrate with most quote unquote high risk or e-com CRMs like WooCommerce, Sticky.io, Connective, and so on. So the integration deployment piece is very easy.
Yeah, cool. So then I want to talk a little bit of, okay, you get them activated, but then we have this issue hanging out there, of course, which is the chargebacks.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about, because I know not only, we've been talking about it as a negative, which it is as far as risk is concerned, but it can also be an opportunity. So talk a little bit about how your company manages the chargebacks and how you kind of collaborate with your merchants on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So chargebacks are top of our list as far as the metrics that we look at, chargebacks and volume. And about 2 years ago, we rolled out a chargeback representment service. So we help merchants to keep their chargebacks in check, to reduce chargebacks, and also to help them understand where their chargebacks are coming from by looking at analytics. And it can get very detailed. We can look at chargebacks by BIN. and they can start doing BIM blocking. We can look at chargebacks by affiliate and even sub-affiliate ID. So if they are doing affiliate marketing, which is a huge source of chargebacks, they can really use that intel to weed out the bad affiliates and keep the good traffic. And in this space, chargebacks just happen, and often they happen in large volume. So this service helps us to help our merchants and help keep our portfolio healthy, but it's also a great source of revenue. And as an agent, if you're not doing that right now with your leads, you need to be. Some of these accounts in high risk will see more revenue from chargeback mitigation than we ever do for processing.
Yeah. Well, because again, it's so important because the primary need of the merchant is just being able to process payments. Predictably. And once they have the account active, I would imagine the number one reason it would become canceled or they wouldn't be able to process is that they had too many chargebacks. They didn't deal with it appropriately. And therefore, the bank said, hey, we don't want to deal with you anymore. This is too much of a risk.
Absolutely.
Right. So,
right.
Okay. So shifting gears a bit, I have kind of one last topic here that I wanted to touch on, and that is compensation. So I always struggle with this, Josh. I don't know about you, but like when I'm talking to agents who are lower risk or low risk ISOs, and they're like, okay, well, what's the Schedule A cost? What's the residual split? And I'm like, that's not the language that you use to describe compensation. I mean, it is, but it's a little, you know what I mean? It's a little different the way you think about it.
Yeah.
Because it's more of just a dollars, analysis here. So talk about that a little bit. When you're talking to a low risk agent, they've got some high risk deals, but they're not used to dealing with that. How do you describe how the compensation works as it relates to high risk?
So, well, the compensation works the exact same way. It's just that the numbers are bigger. So, like I mentioned before, merchants in the high risk space, they are price sensitive to a degree, but that is not their pain point. Their pain point isn't, hey, I'm paying too much. It's, hey, I can't process at all. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to compensation, James, you could probably speak to this better than I could on low risk deals. What's a typical margin in terms of basis points you might see on a low risk deal? 20 basis points?
Probably 20 or 30 on traditional and probably 150 on cash discount. But again, those deals are going to generally be smaller volume is the difference there.
Yeah. Yeah. So in high risk, we typically see not 20 basis points, but around about 2 points.
Right. So 200 basis points.
200.
I'll let that silence kind of sit there for a second, because it's a big difference, and especially if a merchant is doing high volume,
right.
The revenue can be pretty significant. But on average, in terms of margin, we see 1.8 to 2% margin on every deal. So
about 10 times the norm in a low risk environment.
Yeah, just to make it even more clear, as an example, if you had a merchant processing $100,000 this month, we would see roughly $1,800 to $2,000 in gross commissions from that.
Right. And again, though, I think where the confusion comes is kind of the way you get to that number, right? So like for a traditional account, you might say, well, we got to that number because we have a Schedule A cost of, 3 cents and 3 basis points and a 60% or 70% residual split. Whereas, and we charge them, we charge them 3% or something. Whereas when, or interchange plus 40 basis points or something like that, when we're talking about high risk, the merchant might be paying 5, 6, 7%, right? Mm-hmm. And then the split might be significantly lower, the percentage, because the bank wants to keep some, pretty good chunk of this to offset their risk. But the net effect is the profits generally are higher with high risk, even though these percentages and things are a little different. Did I say that right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is pretty accurate. And it's not always, 2 points. There are some verticals, some business types that are so high risk that underwriters will have minimum pricing that you need to do. And the minimum pricing could be, 795, really high, right?
Wow.
But, the bank needs that just to approve the deal, just to offset the risk. So the pricing and Schedule A's and whatnot works basically the same with high risk. There's still a Schedule A, there's still a buy rate, but often the buy rate is a little bit higher, and the split is typically lower. So low risk, I know we're partnered with for low risk, we've got a 90% split. high risk is going to be closer to 50%-ish. And I think, done a good job of being really aggressive with our splits, but it's going to be a lower split. And those business types that I was talking about that are higher risk, between that minimum pricing and the commission schedule, you might see something closer to like 40, 50 basis points on the deal, and maybe make up for that in gateway fees and whatnot.
Right. So yeah, and I think it's just an interesting one. I mean, again, net effect, it's more profitable, but just the way you're getting to that profit looks a little different. So I think for an agent getting into it, it's like, just be open to some different ways of looking at this. It's ultimately about making more money. The way you get there, is just a little bit different. So, okay. So I love this. I mean, I think we could go on for quite some time talking about all this stuff, but I do want to give you a chance, of course, to talk about how you work with agents and ISOs a little bit. So talk about that model. If it's an agent or an ISO listening and they're saying, hey, we have high risk deals, or we want to go after high risk deals. How do you work with them to help them to create a profitable portfolio?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we do work with a lot of agents. Some are, properly in high risk, and some are, in low risk, and maybe they want to kind of add some high risk and, some margin to their portfolio.
Right.
So I like to think we're, a very kind of hands-on company. So, phone calls, I love talking shop with agents and merchants and sharing ideas. We often, exchange contacts. If a merchant is looking for a fulfillment house or a customer service team, we're happy to do those kind of intros to help them move along. And the same goes with agents, suggesting trade shows like affiliate summits and other things that they can do to drive traffic. To build a profitable book in high risk, you need to prospect, right? You need to get familiar with the space. You need to have the banks. That's the biggest thing. So the first thing, if you have a seasoned high risk merchant that you're going after as an agent, probably one of the first questions they'll ask you is, what banks are you with? Right. So if you're only with Vantif or, one ISO, that's a huge disadvantage. And you need to really to add those in. And again, I think that's really where our value lies, and how we can help agents the most is they don't have to do all that. It took us, 7 years, 7 years to build up 35 different acquiring relationships. So they can come to us. Yeah. We can get them access to all those right away, and also some consulting and say, hey, what are you going after? How can we help? What's the best way to do it?
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Josh, great stuff. I know a lot of people in our audience are going to want to reach out. They're going to want to learn more. Do you have a website link or other ways you would place you'd send them to learn more?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're interested in checking out Helios Payments and learning about high risk, learning about us, you can just go to heliospayments.com/agents, plural. James, you're welcome to intro anyone directly to me. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has about the high risk space. So
awesome. And that is Helios is spelled Helios. So it's Helios payments.com/agents, heliospayments.com/agents. And of course, we'll put that in the email in the show notes as well. Josh, as always, man, it's a pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much for taking your time today to share your insights with us.
Yeah. And thank you both. Thank you, Patti. Thank you, James. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been great. Learned a lot. Well, folks, today's episode is brought to you by ISO AMP. ISO AMP is James's brainchild. So I'm going to leave it to him to explain a little bit about it.
Yeah, definitely. So statement analysis. So we believe three things at ISO AMP. We believe statement analysis is important. Number one. Now, course. We're moving to, there's flat rate pricing, there's cash discount, there's different things, but statement analysis is more than just savings analysis. It's also about margin. And it's about understanding the statement, understanding what you're dealing with. But of course, also there's these other segments, whether it's high risk, whether it's B2B, whether it's traditional pricing on larger merchant accounts, whether it's generating proposals. We believe that analyzing statements is important. Secondly, we believe that accuracy is important.
Oh, yes, it is.
This is a belief that we think that a lot of our competitors do not believe quite as strongly as we do. But we believe accuracy is important. And that means you have to have trained professionals that are able to handle the statements and handle situations that the AI cannot. We're actually heading to the MWAA here next month. And while we're there in our booth, we're going to actually show some of the statements that we get and some of the proposals we've returned. Statements that are crooked, blurry. You know, they were taken on somebody's lap while they were driving down the road with their phone.
With their phone, right?
You know, this is the reality of it. And we believe statement analysis is important enough. If you're discouraging your agents from sending a statement because you don't want to deal with it, that's a huge mistake, because statement analysis is important. Accuracy is important. If you're going to get statement analysis done, you need to know it's going to be done right. And then finally, number 3, we believe you need statement analysis that you can trust. And by that, what we mainly mean is you need statement analysis you can trust to fully outsource. We had in the last 2 weeks, 2 of the largest companies in the industry that everybody would know. I'm sure we'll do some posts and stuff with them. But these 2 companies went the entire way now and have fully delegated statement analysis to our company. And by that, I mean their agents are logging into a branded version of our system. It looks just like it's their system, not our system, of course. They log in, they upload their statements. If they have questions about it, they put a question in there, which comes to our team. We respond through the system. So everything looks like it's their statement analysis department, but it's really our company doing everything. And they want, they're out of it. And now that it's just a cost, it's not an inconvenience. Now they're going, wow, let's really encourage. They're sending emails out. They're promoting it to their team and saying, send statements in. We want as many as you can send. Because when you really break it down and like, oh, it's just a cost, it's X per statement, and we're very cost effective. It's like, well, wait a minute. We want as many of these as we can get. These are all leads for merchant accounts. So they're encouraging statement analysis instead of as like a necessary evil. So they've gone that full direction. So where we're at right now, I'm very excited about the company. I haven't talked about it a lot, but I'm very confident we're the leader in analyzing statements. We do thousands of statements a month. And again, it's full service, fully branded, fully customized. We have a fantastic solution. So if you want to learn more about that, whether you're an individual agent, you've got multiple processing companies you sell for, and you want one statement analysis department, or you're an ISO and you want a fully branded experience where you can take that one person in your company or those 2 people in your company that really understand the industry, and you want to maybe have them deploy their time more profitably than keying data into a spreadsheet all day. Outsource statement analysis to a company that you can trust. Go to getisoamp.com. So it's GETISOAMP.com, getisoamp.com. Check it out. We've made huge strides. Are at right now about 90% of our statements we turn around in less than 30 minutes.
That's great.
We do have some that, of course, require review. They require a lot of data entry. Every single statement you send us, we will do it. We will do it accurately. We do 100% of the work. You do none of the work. We send it to you, then you can edit the pricing and all that in our system. But as far as analyzing the statement, pulling the data from the statement, categorizing the data from the statement, we do 100% of the work. So check it out. Go to getisoamp.com, request a free demo. My team will follow up, and I would really appreciate it.
And you will really appreciate it too.
Yes. Thanks, Patti.
And now, here is questions from the field with James Shepard.
So, Patti, today I'm going to talk about how to sell dual pricing. I've talked a lot about dual pricing, compliance, and things like that. And I've actually had a lot of people that have been asking me, even ISOs that use our training subscription, James, when is the video course going to come out on how to sell dual pricing, And I told them all the same thing. It will come out as soon as I sell a good bit of dual pricing. I'm a big believer in you got to sell it if you want to train people on how to sell it.
Got to do it before you teach it.
Yes. So that's what I've been doing. So I've been going out. Obviously, I have 4 companies that I run, so it's not like I can go out and sell payment processing all day.
You've got plenty of spare time, James.
Yeah,
at least Sunday evenings, maybe Thursday mornings.
I have 4 kids, so those times don't work either.
Forget that.
So, But anyway, so I've been going out just a few hours a week. You saw a post on Facebook, I think, about I took my son with me to do an install.
Loved it. And if you haven't seen that, go on Facebook and look at it. James's son is cute anyway. I think all kids are cute. So,
of course, but we had a lot of fun.
He had him actually helping him out. We're getting, get him started young, James.
Yeah, 10 years old. And he was, I made him put in the Wi-Fi password on the number pad, which took forever because it's 25 characters or something. And he had to, we didn't bring a USB keyboard. I'm a little rusty. So anyway, so he did that for me, but we had a lot of fun putting our Valor terminals in, of course, with dual pricing, multiple, 2-location deal. So anyway, so I've been selling it. I've sold physical location. I've sold some, one card not present merchant using a virtual terminal solution. And then I also have sold several of the integrated payment now that we updated my CC Storage, the ISV that I own, the software company. And I did some of the sales myself personally over Zoom, just because I wanted to see how does this work in a kind of a vertical specific environment. So I definitely feel like I have a handle on it, and I have really good news to share very quickly. Just a couple things I want to share with everybody about dual pricing. Next week, we're going to dive into more detail on how to overcome some of the main objections, like my customers are going to not like it, that sort of thing. But here's the thing. Dual pricing, we've already talked about the advantages in terms of compliance, the fact that Visa is against the non-cash adjustment. But I think actually the better reason to switch to dual pricing is that it is much more intuitive and easy to explain to the merchant.
Yeah, sure.
So, ultimately I have all these videos I've done over the years on how to explain cash discounting to the merchant. And it's complicated because at a high level, you're saying, I'm going to show you how to implement a cash discount by adding a fee.
That's always struck me as odd, incongruous,
It is. And I think merchants kind of, struggle with it a little bit. In addition to that, consumers don't really like seeing an extra fee on the receipt, as we talked about with Keith Sampson recently from NAB. So there's several kind of pain points there. Dual pricing is much easier and intuitive. So when you walk into the merchant location, step number one is you should be generating curiosity and questions. If you're not doing that, you're giving way too much information initially. So curiosity and questions. So when I walk in, I don't say, hey, would you like to pass the cost of processing onto the consumer through a higher card price? That's not a good idea. And I've actually heard a lot of agents that don't maybe say it quite that badly, but that's pretty much what they do.
Right.
And you can't do that. So instead, what you do when you walk in is you start out by talking about eliminating the processing fees. Maybe you have a monthly fee, so you talk about flat rate processing. One of my friends that sells a lot of these programs, he says, hey, the reason I stopped by today is I do flat rate payment processing, $29.95 a month. You can process as much volume as you want. There's no percentage or per item fees. So that's what he says right off the bat. And so that just generates a lot of curiosity, especially a larger merchant's like, what? How would you do that? And then he goes, so you're going to start off small talk, all the normal things you would do. But then when they ask you, well, what do you mean? And how does it work? Well, now, instead of going into this complex kind of awkward discussion about non-cash adjustment fees, instead you say, well, you know how fuel stations for the last 50 years have been doing a cash and a card price, and the card price is a little higher, and I'll usually even ask the merchant, why do you think they have a higher card price? And they'll say, well, because it costs money to take cards. Exactly. Right. So I'll say, now what you might not realize is because gas stations have been doing that for so long, all of their point of sale systems and technology is geared towards being able to do that. Whereas for your pizza shop or your, furniture store, hardware store, the technology hasn't been around to do this effectively in the right way. Now that technology exists. So what I would like to do is help you to be able to set up a cash and a card price. Okay. Now your current price that you have now, that would be the cash price, but our technology is going to gross up just a tiny little bit and take the cash price up to make a card price. Our company is going to take the difference, that tiny little bit of extra revenue. We're going to collect that from you each day. We're going to use that to offset the cost of payment processing. The net effect for you is your revenue is the same as it is now, but you're not going to pay any payment processing costs.
And you're presenting to the consumer a cash and a card price, correct?
Card price. Letting the consumer choose which one they want.
And does it also require signage in the front and at the cash register?
It does. Right. And I've actually not been, again, it's such a new concept. I, haven't been able to talk to too many ISOs about the signage yet. I actually don't like a lot of the signage I'm seeing for these programs. But anyway, we're getting there. Even the sign I put up myself because I was working with the processor on it and I hadn't actually seen their language. I posted a picture of it on the Facebook group, but I put it up and I was like, really? So it needs some work, but yeah, you can put up a very simple sign ideally, which would say we have a cash and a card price. Thank you for your business. Not quite that simple, but pretty close. But yeah, we can do something pretty simple there, but yeah. So that's dual pricing. So again, you have that one other real quick benefit I do want to share. There are markets in the US right now where there's a lot of cash discounting already. I'm in rural central Pennsylvania and it is everywhere. In small part due to me, because early on I was selling it, but there's a lot of other people now that have been selling it too. So a lot of people have the cash discount program. So now I'll go in with them and I'll say, maybe I'll buy something from them if I can, but I'll say, I couldn't help but notice here that you're doing the cash discounting. How's that working out? And they'll say, oh, we love it. Usually, it's no problem. And I'll say, well, that's great. I said, now I'm sure your current processor today, have they reached out to you? I'm sure in the last month or so with that memo that Visa sent out about how you have to change the way this prints out on the receipt and everything in the next 30 days. They're like, no, they didn't say anything. So I bring the memo with me and I literally have it highlighted and I show them and I say, well, here you go. And I have it highlighted where it talks about non-compliant cash discounting, where it adds a fee and all this stuff. Then I say, then they'll, say, yeah, it has to change. It's just a slight change, but it's a really, really important change. And then they'll say, well, what does it have to change to? And I'll say, well, actually, it's funny you asked that. Visa actually put a memo out several years ago that spells out exactly what you're supposed to do. You've ever been to a fuel station where they have a cash and a card price, and then I show them the other memo. Anyway, that's what I do. If you'd like copies of that memo and stuff, just go to ccsalespro.com/insights, and you can download the dual price case for dual pricing. And I have the images there with that language, and so you can grab that there. But anyway, so that's the big benefit. Selling dual pricing. Now, if you listen in next week, I have a really interesting story to tell you. I was installing a terminal and a consumer walked up before the terminal was installed and had a very interesting conversation with the owner of the furniture store as we were installing the terminal. Me and Donnie were there installing the terminal. And so I'm going to share that next week. And I want to talk about overcoming the objection of my consumers aren't going to like it, and talk about how dual pricing also is really, really much better in terms of dealing with that objection. So tune in next week and I'll share that story with you. But that's my highlights on dual pricing and how to sell.
Looking forward to next week. Thanks, James.
This is the Insider's Report with Patti Murphy.
So, James, this week I want to share some news from the crypto front. We've talked a lot about that over the last several months. First, the bad news. The Federal Trade Commission reports that fraudsters have stolen over $1 billion in cryptocurrencies from at least 46,000 Americans since the start of 2021.
Wow.
That's a lot of money, and cryptocurrency scams accounted for about $1 in $4 reported loss to fraud in that time period, which is more than any other form of payment, according to the FTC. And things could get worse. Because of the losses covered in the FTC's report. That's, $1 billion, right?
Right.
680 million of that was in 2021. So that tells me it's just going up.
Yeah, sure.
Nearly half that amount, 329 million in the first 3 months of 2022. So you do that and you're thinking, times 4, that's about $1.25 billion, something around there.
Yeah.
And most of the reported losses were in the form of payments made using Bitcoin.
Sure.
Now the scams, most of the scams begin on social media, involve investments that turned out to be too good to be true, or romance scams, many of those of which have an investment angle.
Okay.
Now, the FTC report comes amid extreme volatility in the crypto market. Anybody who's been paying attention lately knows that the price of Bitcoin has tumbled dramatically from about 69,000 in November of 2021 to this week. It's the 17th of June that I'm recording this. Today, it's trading at just over $20,000.
Yeah, I literally had it pulled up when you started talking about Bitcoin. I pulled it up.
I knew I did, right?
20,503.20, and 6 months ago it was at 50,000.
Yes, and 9 months ago it was at 70,000.
Right.
So, and Ethereum, which is another one of the, I think that's like they say it's the second most popular behind Bitcoin.
Right.
Its market value has been slashed by 75% since November 2021. Went from $44.26 to just over $1,100 today. And,
I think one of the interesting things, and I know this is not what this segment is about, but I think it's interesting that, these cryptocurrencies, while I do think long-term there's something viable here, because they're not based on anything other than just kind of the trust of the market.
Right.
The problem with that is when trust begins to erode, that tends to kind of multiply on itself and go exponential.
Yeah, it's like it's viral, really.
It is.
You know,
it is. It's like, well,
Yeah.
if everybody doesn't believe it's worth anything, then it's not worth anything. So I
Right.
better sell it before everybody else believes. It's like, so I think there's a lot of volatility there. But I think on the other side too, we have to remember that as an asset class, even though they've grown a lot, Bitcoin relative to say the US dollar or the pound or something, or the yen, I mean, it's like a gnat on the back of an elephant.
well,
So,
it is. Yeah.
obviously the larger the market capitalization of a particular asset class, then obviously the lower the volatility. And so I do think over time, over the next 20 years, these swings will
20 years maybe.
Yeah.
Or there'll be something else that comes along in that.
Well, again,
that
right.
interim.
Right.
Right.
But cryptocurrencies in general as an asset class,
Right.
relative to fiat currencies, it doesn't have the high level of value there. And so it's,
Right.
it's going to have more, volatility. But anyway,
And it doesn't have the
to your insiders,
historical perspective as well.
right. Exactly.
But so anyway, so I told you the bad news. I wanted to give us some good
Yes,
news, because
yes.
you and I have interviewed a few people on this podcast that are, doing supporting crypto payments at the point of sale.
Right.
And there's a new survey by the consultancy Deloitte, which found 85. They surveyed about 2,000 U.S. merchants and found 85% expect digital currencies to be ubiquitous in their respective industries within 5 years.
Oh, wow. Good.
Yeah. And industries represented include digital goods, electronics, fashion, food and beverage, home and garden, hospitality, transportation, all the ones that we've talked about.
Right.
And what was really interesting is that about half of the retailers, the merchants surveyed, said they've already invested more than $1 million towards enabling crypto payments.
Yep.
Now, challenges retailers expect to confront in enabling, these digital currencies include the complexity of integrating with existing financial
Right.
infrastructures
Sure.
or across various currencies, as well
Right.
as regulatory initiatives.
Yes.
The survey, which was interestingly enough, was developed in collaboration with PayPal, also identified steps that payment processors can take to provide more favorable conditions for adoption, including the elimination of traditional hold periods, elimination of transaction costs, incentive programs, things
Sure.
like that. And I just wanted to, interject here a related development, which kind of piqued my interest when I saw that PayPal had, hired Deloitte to do this research.
Right.
I don't know if you saw this yet, but the New York Department of Financial Services has awarded a bit license to PayPal.
Really?
Yeah, it just was a week or two ago.
Huh.
And that because of that, now PayPal account holders can transfer cryptocurrencies to other wallets and exchanges. Makes it a whole lot easier for me to pay you in Bitcoin, for example. And that's, the whole idea with a bit license is it basically gives companies the authorization to operate crypto exchanges in New York, for example, in compliance with New York regulations.
Sure. Wow. That's pretty big deal for PayPal to get that, actually.
I think that's a really big deal.
Yeah,
I think that's a really big deal. So, I think we're going to, we may have some volatility there, but I think this is something that's here to stay.
I agree. I think it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out over the next kind of. I really wouldn't be surprised if the bottom dropped out even further.
I wouldn't either. In fact, I fully expect it to, because I've been watching it for the last month, and the drops have been pretty significant. When you have drops like that, it's pretty easy. Yeah. And how many times has the bottom fallen out of
exactly
Bitcoin? At least this is at least the third time to my knowledge.
And I think maybe the difference this time is this is probably the longest, and I don't know, I guess I should look at it first before I say it, but I would think this has got to be one of the longest kind of steady declines.
I was looking at a chart today, and it's definitely in terms of the scope of the decline. It's much more. It's much steeper than in the past. But again, we're talking about higher values than in the past. You know, I mean, there was a time when Bitcoin was selling for 1,000, and then it dropped down to 500, which looked really bad. But from 60,000 to 20,000 is a whole lot worse.
Right. Yeah. Well, good stuff, Patti. I appreciate the update on all this stuff. Really good.
Sure thing.
Thank you for listening to the Merchant Sales Podcast. Whether you are an industry veteran, processing executive, or just trying to learn about the payment space, we appreciate your time. The Merchant Sales Podcast is a joint production of Greensheet.com and ccsalespro.com, and we hope you will tune in next week for more information and tips on building your merchant services business.